And what I found out was really interesting because compared to the cake I make for my daughter every year for her birthday,
Yes.
I couldn't listen to that. I started thinking about my daughter.
Yes, tangent off to the side, great. A personal connection that in this case did not help with retention. Okay, Kathy.
Apparently being the overachiever I am, I tried to relate it to different senses. I went way off list.
Oh, yeah.
And started to reorganize it based on different sensory perceptions that each one might have.
Did it help? I don't even know, I have not thought about that for this list.
Well, my list was a lot different than yours.
Okay. So you remembered things that you thought were in the list but
Well, I
weren't actually
put
in
things
the list.
like colorful for sight, and then there were flavors with carrot cake and double mint gum and
Oh,
lemonade,
I see.
and metal is cold to the touch.
Got it, okay.
But I teach imagery, for,
Yes.
you know, so,
Yes, so you took it to another level.
no, I was just trying to predict where we were going.
Where we're going
So I
with
could
it.
get props for that, you know.
You did, that is where we're going with it. So the point that this is supposed to help you see is that if a person has a structure in their mind ahead of time that they're expecting to be able to fill with the text, it will make it easier to remember the text. It also makes it easier to understand in the first place. This list didn't have any understanding involved, but in reading, if a person kind of has an understanding of how texts are generally structured, then as they're reading, they're able to fill in the slots with information that they read, which is kind of like having the hooks or the hanger that they can use to retain the information. There's an analogy for this that's a little bit strange, but I like it. It's a cheese grater. It has all the little hooks on it. If you run cheese over a smooth surface, nothing comes off it. But if you run cheese over the cheese grater, all the little bits of cheese, like the bits of text, get stuck on the hooks, like the hooks in the person's brain, and they retain them. So it's good to have some structure in your brain that is going to allow the text to kind of fill in and get stuck there. In memory literature, the terms residue and cue are used a lot. So more residue can build up if you have something like the cheese grater there that's ready to catch the stuff coming off the text into your brain. So you want the residue to build up. And then cues are what allow you to pull up those memories later on. We'll talk about that later. John.
So it seems like a good application in terms of presenting a lesson, like a direct instruction lecture lesson, of providing some sort of note-taking structure in advance for the students. But how do you know like how much is essentially spoon-feeding too much, and how much is, where should that line be?
We're actually going to do some activities that involve note-taking and doing that. We'll start out at a level you'll probably never want to do. It's very much step-by-step, too much step-by-step really, but it helps you think about the very initial decision-making process that is involved in note-taking. Essentially, if you aim low, which sounds the opposite of what we want to do in general, and spoon feed a lot to begin with, that will allow you to develop a sense of how ready students are for the next step. And the spoon feeding, basically, if you, we will talk more specifically about this too, but if you spoon feed while forcing the students to still think about it, so you're not just putting up notes that they copy without any thought going into it. If you give many examples like that, it's basically feeding them input that will allow them to develop the mental structures on their own that then they can use without your help so much, step by step, and even apply it in other classes. And this is the kind of thing where if across classes you're using similar terminology to each other, and you've discussed how you're doing this, or even across years, if all the science teachers have kind of come to an agreement about some ways that they'll do this, then it helps build that structure consistently in the students' minds so that they're getting input 5 times as much with consistent input rather than just one kind of input from you, one kind of input from someone else. And even if you are aware of the connections, you would know this already. The students aren't So even if you decide on something different across departments or within a department, to explicitly bring that to the student's attention. This is the way Mr. Cole does this, this is the way somebody else is doing it. We're doing the same thing, we're just coming at it from a little bit different perspective. So the short answer is, err on the side of giving them too much help, and you'll gradually see that they don't need it anymore and they can move on. But when we kind of just expect them to be able to take a text and take notes, or especially listen and take notes where they can't even go back and look at what's been written before, they have to just retain whatever it is that you just said and have perspective on that in relation to what you said 20 minutes ago and what you said yesterday and will say in the future, it's a kind of overload most of the time, which is probably why, maybe this isn't true, but you probably don't see great examples of notes if you do it that way, that then the students use to study for their tests. If I'm wrong, then I want to talk to you. I want to hear about how you do it, because it's very rare for that to actually occur. Does that ring true? Okay. The answer might have been too vague still, but we're getting to more of it. Okay.
No, but you're right, Caitlin, students will say, we take notes, but you never use them.
Yes. Yes, wrong
I'm
pronoun.
not supposed to use them.
Right.
They want a grade for everything.
They do want grade.
If they did something, they want you to
Right.
pinpoint, that's the
Yeah.
obsession.
Don't see the process leading up to the, which, it's interesting, these articles about use of electronic media also went into kind of like just lack of attention and lack of seeing connection between steps in a process, because it's just not part of general life as much. Just a very quick side story. That was completely brought to my attention in a setting that is not like Lansing Catholic, but in the urban schools I was working in Connecticut. I was the English teacher at, for seventh graders, and it was toward the end of the school year, and they had a choice of 4 different readings to read that day, and answer some questions about them, do something with them. And one of the readings was about logging. And I described it in my description about it being about, now I can't remember, about trees. And the beginning of the article was a couple paragraphs about paper. And there was a student who typically was very angry, but he looked particularly angry, and I was hoping there wouldn't be an explosion as he began to read, and I just went over and I said, what's up? What's the matter? And he said, you said this was about trees and it's about paper. Oh, I forgot to tell you, sorry. Did you know that paper comes from trees? It comes from trees? So no connection there. And from there I started asking, they had no idea, most of them, where food comes from. They didn't know which animals, which kinds of meat came from. If the name didn't tell them already, they knew the chicken was from chickens. Didn't know that that was connected to roosters. So like there's no, sometimes the background information about processes in life that might seem to be kind of part of our everyday culture, just not there. I also do prison ministry, or I haven't been doing it for a few months, but I've done it for a while, and this is all adult men in prison, and I talked to, it's a longer story, but one day manure came up, and there was a handful of people in the room, there were probably about 50 men in the room, a handful of them did not know that manure is used to put on fields and helps our food be more nutritious and taste better and all of that stuff. And completely blown away and shocked, and really didn't know if they should believe me or not that I was saying this. That would be a very strange thing to learn as an adult. I can't even imagine not knowing that from when you were a child. But the lack of knowledge that I experienced there helped open my eyes to, okay, don't make any assumptions. I don't think you're gonna come across that here, right? But you don't know what other kind of assumptions we might be making, but they just don't have
the challenge is that, like, that's true of most of our kids, but I think every now and then we get a kid who, like, we make those assumptions
Yes.
on, because most of our kids have those understandings.
Yes.
And then you have that one kid
They
who
don't-
just feels completely,
Yeah, yes, who were called on just as much to help
Mhm.
them fill in all those gaps.
Well, street smarts compared to book smarts too.
Right.
Going out to
Yes.
the real world living, and they go, what, you do that?
Yes. Yes. Those kids in Connecticut certainly had other knowledge that I learned from. Okay, so back to this. This is that spoken language bubble with word, phrase, clause, discourse. We're gonna talk a little bit more detail about discourse, and there's two terms I wanna introduce, that got cut, but macrostructure and microstructure. So you just think about the structure of those words. Macro means big, large, micro, small. So macrostructure is the structure of text at the discourse level. So it's across the sentences, paragraphs, it's the big picture of the text. In narrative text, this is the character setting, initiating event, character's response, all the plot type things. It's different for other kinds of text, and we'll talk about that. Microstructure are the specific words in the language used to build that macrostructure. The linguistic items, the phrases, sentences, at the sentence level and below. If you take away nothing else from today, please take away this one sentence. If you help students see the structure in language, you will have benefited them. Help them see the structure in language. At the big level, the whole text, the sentence level, the phrase level, the word level, across texts, the connections between spoken language and written language and the differences. So discourse, it's traditionally kind of divided into three different parts. There's lots of different ways of talking about this, but this is the traditional one. That there's conversation, narrative, and expository text. Conversation is what kids have been exposed to until they get to school, talking. It's not academic language typically. It can be, they're from certain kinds of families, but it's typically not. It's more informal, doesn't have as rich a vocabulary, but can still have quite a rich vocabulary. It just doesn't have the academic terms in it as much. Narrative is kind of the next step. It's the text that goes with stories. That can be very formal, they can be informal, talking about what happened to you today, or they can be the very formal kind of fairy tale or novel type structure. Comments, thoughts?
No, I'm just thinking about when I tell kids, when I was your age, then they say, oh, she's gonna tell a story.
Yes, it's exciting. And they've gradually developed more of a framework for the world when you were their age. And then expository text is the most distant from conversation. That's what the students would be reading in the content classes that you teach, so science, social studies, theology. If there's reading and math, that would be more along the lines of expository. So discourse is organized, connected ideas. It can be spoken or written. It's beyond the level of the single sentence. The discourse continuum, so this thing up here with the arrows at both sides, it just keeps extending out to infinity, has kind of what tends to be more spoken on this side and what tends to be more written on this side. So children get lots of input on this end, so they learn that. They get all the input on that end, and they learn to speak that way. In order to learn to produce written compositions that have more academic language, what's going to help them? So I'll just say that exact same thing again. They have received lots of narrative type input, conversational input, and so they're able to speak in that way. If we want them to produce, so compose, speak, and encode more academic type writing, what do we need to do?
More exposure.
Yes, give them lots of exposure to written style text. If you can speak that way all the time to them, that will give them the input, but nobody does that. And it sounds very odd if somebody tries to. What they need is the written text, the written input. If you read aloud to them, it will be that same kind of input. But it's not just the having the input that matters, it's the having awareness of the structure of the input. Just like that activity that we just did, you all had the same input, but you were affected by your knowledge of the structure of the input. And you could have been adversely affected by false knowledge of the structure of the input, or false expectations. So if a person reads an expository text expecting it to be like a conversation, they're going to be very confused. So to have explicit teaching to them of the structure of the kind of texts that you are reading with them or having them read will help. But in order for them to do that, you have to understand the structure of your own texts, which you may not have thought about ever. You may have thought about it to some extent. We'll be doing it this afternoon. So it goes from informal and more conversational to formal, literate, academic, contextualized to decontextualized. This has a lot to do with English as a second language learning too, or learning a second language from video. Lack of context really makes it harder to understand, to comprehend. So that context can be, in a conversation, there's context all around you. So it's easier to understand. If you're just reading a text and have no background knowledge, no ability to pull up what you would imagine the context to be, it's going to be more difficult to understand. Conversation tends to be highly contextualized. Expository texts tend to be much less contextualized and have much less help for contextualizing. So macrostructure is the big picture. Oops. Sorry. In other words, the organization of the text as a whole, it can be talked about in terms of genre or the gist or the theme overall. It's the idea of the big picture. We did those in the activity. We've kind of briefly talked about this. The narrative discourse has all those characteristics and plenty of others related to plot. Expository macrostructure, I'm going to give you handouts on this. Right now. Thank you.
I got it.
Okay, thanks. Actually, thank you.
That's great.
Thank you. So, this sheet that you're about to get, it has at the top descriptions of several different kinds of macrostructure, which I'm going to list up here. I just want you to try and fill in the blanks. There is, oh no, there's the same number. There's one missing in it. Is 11:30 when we're stopping for lunch? Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, so,
If the food's there.
okay, sounds good. So the blanks on that page are what you're trying to fill in, where it says macrostructure several kinds. The first one, the text tells what something is. Which one of these is likely to name that? Descriptive. The text tells how to do or make something. Yes. Sequence or procedural. The text gives reasons for why something happens. Cause and effect. The text states a difficulty and ways to address it. Yes, sorry. Tell me if I stand there. The text tells how things are the same or different. Yes. The text lists examples or things related to the topic. Yes. So for all of these except one of them, there are typical microstructure features that kind of go along with the macrostructure. So in narrative macrostructure, there are microstructure features like the phrase "once upon a time" or "when I was your age." These kind of phrases that clue you in that what's about to come will have a character and a setting, and so on. In narratives, the temporal adverbs are also very common. First, next, then, finally. They lived happily ever after is another little microstructure feature common to narratives. So microstructure, words, phrases, sentences, the building blocks of the macrostructure. The detail, it has details. I'm going to, if you turn over the sheet that you just had, so for descriptive macrostructure, it has kind of this is done by somebody else, so I just stuck with their definition. It's very similar. But then what's, to me, the most important is that list in the middle of the microstructure, some microstructure examples. Language signal words that are often included in that kind of text. We'll be using that for something later on. But just take a look, and I'm going to hand you out several other examples for other kinds of macrostructure. You're getting good exercise. Thank you.
It's all about the steps.
Oh, perfect. And I'm coming behind with a different one that looks very similar in thinking once you look at the details.
Did I give you an extra one? It's funny when we're being here. I have a good one there. That's a lie. I understand it sounds this way.
I win. Not that it
I've
was
always
a
been slow.
competition.
Oh,
Okay, great.
okay, so there's five.
Have you been keeping extras somewhere for the people who aren't here?
Behind Rod is where I put the last one.
Okay, thanks. I'll put you in there.
This is the one.
And the one you handed me the time before had exactly the red number. I know, I was very impressed.
That's actually not good, because there's supposed to be enough for those people who aren't here.
Well, maybe you had the leftovers.
Oh. This one, I put extra stuff. Yep, it's over there. There it is, okay, yeah. Thank you.
And Caitlin, even if they're not, I know Doug can work the copier.
Okay, thank you.
Many.
There should be all set right, but thank you.
Changes.
All right, so will you just choose one of those and take a look at it for a moment? Ideally, choose one that you think would be closely related to what you teach. What kind of macrostructure would come up frequently in your class? In math, there is more reading than people often think, so you might already be aware of that, but depending on what level of math you're teaching, it can be kind of descriptive, narrative type stories. It can be a lot of enumeration, which there is not a microstructure list for that, because enumeration is just listing.
Spent $200
All right, any questions before I move on? All right.
Did he recognize?
So we're going to cover, we are going to cover 3 different examples of specific microstructure features that might be useful for you in helping analyze your own text that you use for class and helping bring your students' attention to them. So we're going to do a couple examples now, but then later on this afternoon, you'll have your choice for what's relevant for your class, but this kind of thing might be relevant for your own text. So just kind of have your awareness up of thinking about how could this relate to something that your students read, or that you'd like them to read but haven't dared to try. So the 3 ones are cohesion, parallelisms, and synonyms. So on your colored sheet, there are 3 blanks at the bottom there. Cohesion, parallelisms, and synonyms. And there won't be much to say about any of those, but you might want to copy down the very basic part of the definition that we do now. So for cohesion are microstructure, words, phrases, sentences that make clear the connection between ideas, the relationship of one idea to another. So cohesion is a technical term that actually makes this sound more complicated than it is, in my opinion. But it's essentially the idea that repeated words in texts are an indicator of what's important in that text. If a certain word comes up over and over and over, that's one of the basic ideas in that text. So this is one of the first kind of skill awarenesses that students can have that will allow them to develop good note-taking skills. So John, what we're doing here kind of begins to feed into your question. Probably not in the way you're expecting, but it is directly related to note-taking later. So repetition of words or little phrases. Conjunctions, transition words, cohesive ties, those are different terms for the same things in different fields. So it's words like therefore, next, finally. It's the little lists that are on those sheets that I just gave you. As a result, consequently, because, those kind of things. Okay, so the article that I gave you before, that is the stapled article, I forget what it's called right now. Yes, thank you. I meant to number the paragraphs before I gave it to you, so I didn't go back through and individually number all the copies. Would you mind just numbering the paragraphs? So the first one only has one sentence, but would you just number in the margin so that I can refer to certain paragraphs?
I got 9.
Me too.
Okay, good.
So this whole inventing one does
That's the only reason
for us
why
visual people.
solution number.
I'm just wondering.
That was like a
Who's gonna watch
Yeah,
this?
I told you.
So for now, we're going to stick with focusing on this idea of cohesion that comes through repetition. This is not complicated, it's just looking for words that are repeated, or phrases that are repeated. The words can be morphologically related. That means they have the same root, but maybe different endings. So children and child could count together as a repeated word, even though they're different words. Depends on how you define word. So we'll skip paragraph number 1. Can you just start numbering yourselves? We'll do 2 through 8, so 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Would you say the numbers now?
No,
Skip
skip one.
Sorry. I know, I'm sorry. 2.
3.
Didn't we get 9 paragraphs?
Oh, I thought you were 5.
6.
Or 7.
7.
8.
2,
3.
4, 5, 6.
7, 8.
Wow, perfect. Okay, will you take the number of paragraph that you just were assigned? If you forget, just choose a paragraph. And look through that paragraph, searching for repeated words or repeated phrases.
Everybody else.
You are blessed with more input
That was
today.
a 7,
Isn't
right?
this wonderful?
Yeah, you're 7.
Yours is pretty short.
If you'd like to count how many words, you can do that.
Wait, can you explain that again? We're counting,
You're counting repeated words, so not counting, you're just looking for words that are repeated in there. So if you see child in there twice, write that down as one of the words that you see multiple times in there.
but not if we see children. Children and child are different.
No, you can
Okay.
count those as the same. Sorry, so yes, count those as a repeated word.
Okay.
So children and child or walked and walking can count as the same word.